I deeply regret that a life was taken. And I also like to make clear that although I've been tried and convicted as being a trigger person in this case.
Have you ever wondered what goes through a killer's mind on the last day of their life? The final hours before the world closes in and the ultimate sentence is carried out. For Warren McCleskey, those last 24 hours were anything but ordinary. For 13 years, Warren McCleskey sat on death row in Georgia alone, with the weight of a death sentence and the shadow of a question much bigger than his own case. Does race decide who lives and who dies in America's courts? Now time was running out fast. With every hour that passed, his chances slipped further away. But that day held a shocking twist, someone who would change everything. Or so it seemed. What happened in those final moments? Did he show remorse? Did he fear death or welcome it? This is the final 24 hours of Warren McCleskey. Warren McCleskey was born on March 17, 1945 in Marietta, Georgia. Growing up in the segregated South, he faced systemic racism and limited opportunities, which shaped his early experiences. His family lived in poverty, and McCleskey attended segregated schools, where he was subjected to the harsh realities of racial inequality. On the afternoon of May 13, 1978, Warren McCleskey entered the Dixie Furniture Company in Atlanta, Georgia. He was involved in an armed robbery along with an accomplice. During the robbery, a struggle broke out with police officers who responded to the scene. Police officer Frank Schlott arrived as backup. During the confrontation, Officer Schlott was shot and killed. Warren McCleskey admitted to taking part in the robbery, but insisted that he was not the one who fired the fatal shot. McCleskey said that his accomplice, who was also involved, was responsible for the shooting. Despite this claim, McCleskey was charged with the murder of Officer Schlott under the legal doctrine of felony murder, which holds all participants in a felony responsible for any deaths that occur during the crime. Warren McCleskey's trial began later that year. The prosecution argued that McCleskey was guilty of both armed robbery and murder and pushed for the death penalty. The defense acknowledged McCleskey's role in the robbery, but argued that he was not the shooter. They also highlighted his troubled background and raised concerns about racial bias in how the death penalty was applied in Georgia. Despite these efforts, the jury found McCleskey guilty of both charges. In the sentencing phase, the jury recommended the death penalty. The judge accepted this recommendation, and McCleskey was sentenced to death. In that moment, McCleskey must have felt a mix of fear, despair, and anger. Fear for the unknown that awaited him. Despair that his life was now slipping through his fingers with little hope of escape. And anger not only at his fate, but at a system that seemed stacked against him, one that ignored the very real evidence suggesting racial bias played a role in condemning him. For a man who knew the harsh realities of injustice all too well, the conviction might have felt like a confirmation of everything he feared about the world around him. The cold reality was clear. His life would end behind bars, his last days filled with uncertainty and pain. What made McCleskey's case stand out was the defense's use of a groundbreaking study by Professor David Baldus. This research analyzed thousands of murder cases in Georgia and found a clear racial disparity. Defendants accused of killing white victims were far more likely to receive the death penalty than those accused of killing black victims. McCleskey's lawyers used this study to argue that racial discrimination influenced the decision to sentence him to death. However, when McCleskey's case reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 1987, the High Court justices ruled against him in a 5-4 decision. It said that to prove an equal protection violation, McCleskey needed to show that the decision-makers in his specific case acted with racist intent. The statistical study wasn't enough to prove this. For the Eighth Amendment claim, the court said that some discretion in sentencing is necessary and acceptable. It explained that McCleskey's death sentence wasn't arbitrary and capricious. This is because Georgia's system focused on the specific details of the crime and the defendant. The court acknowledged that racial bias in the justice system was concerning, but it said the study didn't prove that race definitely influenced death penalty decisions or McCleskey's case specifically. Now the execution date is set September 25, 1991. Behind the prison walls, time moves differently. For McCleskey, every minute stretched out, heavy with dread. What thoughts filled his mind during those lonely hours? Did he replay the events over and over, wondering if anything could have changed? Did he think of his family, the life he lost, the chances he never got? No one can say for sure what exactly he felt in those last hours, but the human truth remains. Facing death is one of the most profound and terrifying experiences anyone can endure. For Warren McCleskey, the final day was not just the end of a life. It was the final act in a story marked by pain, injustice, and a desperate search for fairness. It was 6 o'clock on a cold gray morning when Warren McCleskey's final 24 hours began. Outside the prison walls, the world was waking up to a new day. The sun slowly climbing over the horizon, birds beginning their songs, life carrying on as usual. But inside his cell, time felt frozen, heavy with the knowledge that this day would be unlike any other. For Warren McCleskey, it was the last sunrise he would ever see. The night before had been filled with frantic legal battles, but the crushing blow came the previous morning, Tuesday, September 24th, when the 5-member Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied McCleskey's clemency petition. This board alone held the power to commute death sentences in Georgia, and their decision effectively closed off the last official path to avoid execution. What made this decision even more heartbreaking were the statements from 2 jurors who said information had been improperly withheld during McCleskey's trial, information that might have changed their minds about sentencing him to death. Those jurors no longer supported his execution, but their voices were not enough to sway the board. The day had been a whirlwind. McCleskey's execution was originally scheduled for 7 p.m. Tuesday night, but Federal District Judge J. Owen Forrester granted several brief stays, first pushing the time to 7:30, then 10 p.m., then midnight, to hear last-minute appeals filed in multiple courts. The morning routine was cold and clinical. The clatter of keys and footsteps echoed down the narrow corridor as the guards made their early rounds. Their faces were unreadable, but the weight of the moment hung thick in the air. They gently roused McCleskey from a restless night's sleep, if sleep had even come at all. The cold metal of the bars, the stark walls, and the dim light were the last sights he would know. As he sat up on the thin mattress, a flood of emotions overwhelmed him. Fear, sorrow, anger, maybe even moments of numbness. The reality of death was no longer distant or abstract. It was here, waiting for him like a silent shadow. His mind likely drifted to memories his childhood in Marietta, Georgia, the struggles he faced growing up in a world divided by race and injustice, the choices that led him here. Did he think of his family? Did he imagine what they were doing at that very moment, unaware that their loved one was hours away from death? The morning routine was cold and clinical. A simple breakfast was brought to his cell, a small tray of food, barely enough to satisfy hunger, but heavy with symbolic finality. Every bite was a reminder that this was the last meal of his life, though the weight on his heart was far heavier than any physical hunger. The hours stretched on, thick with tension and fear. The weight of the impending execution pressed harder with every passing moment. But the legal team did not give up. Another appeal was filed, this time in the federal courts, hoping for a last chance. From 6 a.m. to noon, the hours dragged on slowly, filled with silence broken only by the occasional footsteps or the distant clanging of prison doors. There were no visitors, no last words spoken, just McCleskey, left alone with his thoughts, the cold walls around him, and the creeping inevitability of the hour when his fate would be sealed. As the morning light grew stronger, so did the feeling that time was slipping away too fast each minute, bringing him closer to a final moment none of us can truly imagine. By noon, the sunlight filtering through the narrow windows of Georgia State Prison felt indifferent, unmoved by the weight of the hours it lit. For Warren McCleskey, this wasn't just another afternoon. This was the final stretch between life and death. And though the world outside continued as usual, inside that prison, everything was still, quiet, and unbearably heavy. In that silence, the sound of footsteps down the corridor broke the air. It was his legal team, arriving for what would be their final visit. These were the people who had fought for him tirelessly, relentlessly through court after court, appeal after appeal. They had challenged the system, taken his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and dared to ask the hardest questions about race, justice, and death in America. Their faces likely carried the same exhaustion and heartbreak Warren felt. They knew the door had closed. All legal remedies had been exhausted. Still, they came to stand with him, to show him he wasn't completely alone, and perhaps to offer the smallest measure of human comfort in a system that had shown little. What was said during that visit will never be fully known. Perhaps they talked quietly about the case, about what still could have been. Maybe there were long silences, tears held back, hands gripped tightly. Maybe they didn't speak of the law at all, but of memories, of dignity, of faith. It wasn't just a meeting between a man and his lawyers. It was a final bond, a fragile thread of humanity stretched across the final hours of a man's life. When they left, the weight in the room had doubled. The minutes ticked forward. A final meal was offered. The staff began to prepare. Outside, the sun sank lower in the sky, and the light in Warren McCleskey's cell dimmed. The quiet returned, but now it was even heavier. The last appeal had been denied. The Clemency Board had refused to intervene. The Supreme Court had given its final answer. But lawyer had last chance to appeal. They filed it. And so, McCleskey waited, alone again, with only a few hours left in a life shaped by injustice, defiance, and now, silence. As the hour hand passed 6 p.m., the air inside Georgia State Prison thickened with a silent finality. The sun outside had faded, but within those walls, a different kind of darkness was settling, one that comes when a man is living his final hours, suspended between life and death. Warren McCleskey's execution had been scheduled for 7 p.m., and the preparations were already underway. The electric chair stood ready. The chamber had been cleaned. Witnesses were beginning to arrive. Prison staff moved with quiet precision, each step rehearsed, each instruction followed. For them, it was part of a protocol, but for McCleskey, this was everything. The final night, the countdown had begun. Yet just as the moment approached, the legal system stirred once more. Shortly before 7 p.m., Federal District Judge J. Owen Forrester issued a stay of execution, first delaying it until 7:30, then 10 p.m., and finally midnight, as a final legal appeal was filed in 3 separate courts. His legal team, who had stood by him through every battle, pushed forward one last time, fighting against the tide, knowing the odds were nearly impossible. Inside, McCleskey waited. There was no family with him, no friends, just the sterile quiet of the death row holding cell and the muffled sounds of shuffling feet in the corridors. He was offered a last meal, as was tradition, but he declined. There was no appetite left, not for food, not for comfort, not for ritual. What could he possibly eat, knowing it would be his last? What flavor could break through the numbness of this night? His legal team came to visit him once more, giving him updates, standing by him not just as attorneys, but as the only people in the world still physically present with him. It was more than legal work now. It was companionship in the loneliest hours a person can endure. By 11:20 p.m., the hearing ended. The federal judge had denied the appeal, but left the door open just a crack longer, extending the stay until 2 a.m. so that one final plea could be placed before the U.S. Supreme Court. The waiting was unbearable. McCleskey had already been prepared to die. Now he had to wait again. Each delay brought the faintest flicker of hope and the crushing weight of another countdown. The chair had been tested. The witnesses were ready. The prison was still. And yet he remained in limbo, one foot in this world, the other inching toward the next. By midnight, September 25th had ended, but McCleskey's story had not. Not yet. He sat there, alone, in the deep silence of the prison night, waiting to learn whether the law would end his life or give him just a few more hours. As the clock passed midnight, September 26, Warren McCleskey's fate still hung in the balance. At 2:17 a.m., McCleskey was escorted to the death chamber. He walked steadily, silently. After 13 years on death row, the wait was nearly over. He was strapped into the electric chair, wires fixed to his head and leg. But just 3 minutes later, word arrived that the Supreme Court was still deliberating. The execution was paused. McCleskey was unstrapped and let out again. This was not mercy. This was torment. At 2:53 a.m., officials placed him back into the chair, assuming the delay meant denial. Then at 3:04, confirmation came. The Supreme Court had ruled 6-3 against granting a stay. There would be no more appeals, no more chances. Now it was time. Thick leather straps bound his arms, chest, and legs. Electrodes were fixed to his shaved skull, the steel cap secured tightly in place. Before the execution, Warren McCleskey gave his final statement. Calm, composed, and unwavering, he addressed the room and the country that had condemned him. He apologized to the family of Officer Frank Schlatt, acknowledging the pain his actions had caused. He asked his own family not to hold on to bitterness, to find peace even in the shadow of his death. He spoke of his faith in God, and then he said something that would echo beyond those prison walls. Democracy has failed in this country. He accused the justice system of ignoring the truth, of allowing racism and legal loopholes to shape life and death decisions. Speaking directly about the jurors who sentenced him, McCleskey said they had committed a grave injustice. He had never confessed to being the gunman. He accepted responsibility for his role in the robbery, but not for pulling the trigger. None of the other men involved had been sentenced to death. Only him. He said, "I pray that one day this country, supposedly a civilized society, will abolish barbaric acts such as the death penalty." A minute later, the execution began. A powerful jolt of electricity surged through his body, arms tensed, smoke rising from the headpiece. For those who witnessed it, it was brief but unforgettable. For some, his death was closure. For others, it was a tragedy that proved how deeply broken the system could be. But one thing was clear. Warren McCleskey died not just as a convicted man, but as a voice, one that never stopped challenging the meaning of justice in America. Some say justice was served, others say justice was lost. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments. Was this a system working as it should, or a system that failed? And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dive cases like this one.
I've endured that pain the 13 years I've been here. And I'm saddened by my participation in this awful crime. I deeply regret that a life was taken. And I also like to make clear that although I've been tried and convicted as being a trigger person in this case, I am not the trigger person who shot Officer Schlatt.